Okay, so first of all, Chanukah Sameach. It's strange saying Chanukah Sameach in this kind of weather. I feel like I should be saying, I don't know, well, yeah, no, I guess not. I know Hanukkah, even in Israel, I mean, it's sometimes rainy and more wintry than Hashem in 2 days. We're going to dedicate today's shiur for the 10th yard site, which is tonight, of Dr. Charles H. Feldman, Yitzchak Tzvi Ben Yaakov Alea. So, wow, 10th yard site. You should get strength and koach and kanfumim. Good memories and in wonderful Torah also. There's lots of learning for Hanukkah. Yeah.
Could we also dedicate the share a memory of my mother, who yortzeit tomorrow?
Oh wow! So you have the same yortzeit.
What's
her name?
Batsheva Bat Yehuda Yitzchak.
Batsheva Bat Yehuda Yitzchak. Yeah. So there are source sheets, I'm sure that are
No.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the Mishkan, the Mikdash, right? Of course, Hanukkah is not a Tanakh holiday, and I tend to look for topics in the Tanakh to teach, but the Mishkan is very much a Tanakh topic. It's also very much, the Mikdash is very much a Hanukkah topic, right? Of course, the whole Hanukkah story is precipitated by Antiochus and his evil decrees, of which, of course, a lot of it centered on violation and the sacrilege of the Mikdash, right? Erecting an altar to Zeus in the Mikdash, forcing them to, or sacrificing pigs on the altar, right? So the idea of Chilul HaMikdash, of the violation of the sanctity of the Mikdash, that was a very important event that precipitated the rebellion and the events of Hanukkah. And so I want to talk about the Mikdash in honor of Hanukkah to perhaps better understand what the Mikdash means to us, what the Mikdash means in the Tanakh. There are, of course, when we talk about the Mikdash, I'm going to be a little bit blurring between, and deliberately so, between the Mishkan and the Mikdash, right? Because of course, the Mishkan, which we build in the desert, is the precursor to the Mikdash, right? So the Mishkan, there are obvious differences, and we won't talk about them, but the Rambam says it very clearly, the Mishkan kind of morphs into the Mikdash. It becomes the permanent, immovable building, which used to be portable and moved with them throughout their travels in the desert, and of course, eventually also in Eretz Yisrael, moved from place to place. There's a tremendous amount of detail in our upcoming Parshiot, right? Somewhere around February, with respect to the Mishkan, right? We have 4 Parshiot that are dedicated to the Mishkan, right? Those of us who sometimes teach Parshat Shavua, right, or write a column on Parshat Shavua, we pray for years that the Parshiot are combined, right? Because of course, writing or teaching on Truma, then Tetzava, and then Vayakal, then Pekudei, that's a little bit of a challenge, because again, the description of the construction of the Mikdash, of the Mishkan, is told in great detail. Of the Mishkan in Sefer Shemot, of the Mikdash in Sefer Melachim. Great painstaking detail, right? Especially in Shemot. We have the 2 Parshiot that tell us how to construct, and that's Teruma and Tetzaveh, right? Not just how to construct, but also the vessels and the clothes, the Kohanim, all of the preparations that go into the creation of the Mishkan. And then in Vayaka Pekudei, we have the implementation, also in great detail, right? So these great details show us, at least on one level, how important, how significant this is, and how significant the details are. And in Sefer Melachim also a tremendous amount of detail. But the Mishkan is also centrally featured in Sefer Vayikra as well, right? Of course, all of the beginning of Sefer Vayikra, I would say even, pretty much the first 16 chapters, certainly the first 7 chapters of Sefer Vayikra are all about how do we enter the Mishkan? The answer is with korbanot, right? With sacrifices. And then that's in great detail. Sefer Bimidbar also features the Mishkan. It builds the camp of Israel, right? The way that we encamped in the desert, we camp around the Mishkan, right? The Mishkan is the focal point. It's the center of so much in the Torah. And so what I want to try to understand are some of the conceptual underlying foundations of the Mishkan. What is the Mishkan? What are we meant to understand? And why are we constructing it in such great detail? And so those are some of the questions that I want to deal with today. Sometimes when you look at the broader picture of Tanakh and the broader themes and ideas of the Tanakh, I think a lot of times to begin to understand them, you have to go back to the very beginning, right? That's what Julie Andrews tells us, right? No? Yeah, right. We go back to the very beginning, right? So where's the very beginning? That's Sefer Bereshit, right? And really, it is true that so many of the stories and ideas of Tanakh, they have their roots in Sefer Bereshit, right? And what I want to try to do today, and it's also a study in the way that different stories and different passages in Tanakh intermingle and link one with the other, linguistically and thematically. I want to go back to the earliest stories of Sefer Bereshit and see what we can learn from them for understanding the Mishkan, the idea of Mishkan. Now, to begin, I want to begin with an idea which was actually first proposed, at least to the best of my knowledge, by Martin Buber, and that is that the construction of the Mishkan is modeled linguistically and even structurally on the creation of the world. On the creation of the world, which I think is, it's not necessarily something that is intuitive for me. Right? I would not have thought of that on my own. I saw it in Martin Buber. He developed it to some degree. I'm going to expand on some of these ideas, but let's begin with the parallel, right? What is it that he saw here? So first of all, we talked about the fact that the Mishkan, the construction of the Mishkan really is told in great detail in Parshiot, Truma, and Tetzaveh. And what Buber points out is that actually, if you look at the description, it is divided into 7 paragraphs. Each paragraph begins with the word Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe lemor, or Vayomer Hashem el Moshe lemor. It starts in Perek Kafhei. So, I don't see a lot of Tanakh here. Sorry. Okay, well, for those of you who you could just listen, but if you have a Tanakh in front of you, it would be great to kind of look at Shmot Perek Kafhei Pasuk Aleph Vayidaber. Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe lemor. That's our first paragraph, okay? So for those people on Zoom, you all have an advantage because you can all go get your Tanakh right now. So.
No, you have to tell them they don't have an advantage.
Oh, I wanted to give a little bit of positive attention, right, to people on Zoom. Okay, so our next paragraph actually doesn't appear until Perek Lamed, and the 7th and final paragraph appears in Perek Lamed Aleph, Pasuk Yud Bet. Okay, so everybody turn with me to Perek Lamed Aleph, Pasuk Yud Bet. This is our 7th paragraph of the command to construct the Mishkan. What does it tell us? Vayomer Hashem el Moshe lemor, v'ata daber b'nei Yisrael lemor, ach et shabtotai tishmoru. Right? Pretty remarkable, right? Our 7th paragraph tells us that you have to keep Shabbat. Now again, the Rashbam says, and I brought it for you here in source number 1, Ach et Shabtotai Tishmaru is specifically telling us that when it comes to Melechet HaMishkan, to the construction of the Mishkan itself, you do not do that on Shabbos, right? Of course, we could have thought maybe you do, right? There are certain things, certain mitzvot that maybe trump Shabbat, right? And so we could have thought, or we may have thought that building the Mishkan could also be one of those mitzvot. So the Rashbam says, no, we have here the 7th paragraph that introduces Shabbat in order to tell us that we can't build the Mishkan on Shabbat. But what Buber suggests is that the 7th paragraph already draws our attention to the parallel between the construction of the Mishkan and God's creation of the world. What I think is much more remarkable and much more important for my purposes today is the 6th paragraph. Let's look at the 6th paragraph of the construction of the Mishkan, which is Perek Lamed Aleph, Pasuk Aleph, once again, opening with this kind of formulaic opening that shows us that we have a new paragraph. Vayidaber Adonai el Moshe lemor. I'm in Perek Lamed Aleph, Pasuk Bet. Re'ei karati v'shem Betzalel ben Uri ben Chor l'matei Yehuda. Va'amale oto ruach Elohim b'chokhma ובתבונה, ובדעת, ובכל מלאכה. לחשוב מחשבות, לעשות בזהב, בכסף, ובנחושת. So what do we have in our 6th day, or our 6th paragraph to be more precise? We have God giving wisdom to humans, right? God giving wisdom to what's created on the 6th day, right? Humans, how are humans created? They're created B'Tselem Elokim. What does God give to B'Tzalel ben Uri ben Hur lematei Yehuda? And in a moment in Pasuk Vav, he also calls Oholiav ben Achisamach lematei Dan to work alongside him. What does God give them? God gives them the Ruach Elokim. Remember that Ruach Elokim? Whatever that spirit of God was, that was merachefet al pnei hamayim, that was hovering over the waters, some kind of spirit of divine creativity, the ability to make meaning out of chaos, right? You have a world of tohu vavohu, and God says, I'm going to create something within that world of tohu vavohu. I will say one other thing with regard to the tohu vavohu, which is that, of course, when B'Tzalel is called, right, they're in the desert. One thing that always bothered me, right, just as a sort of trying to visualize the story of the construction of the Mishkan, is where'd they get all the materials from? And some of them, Mepharshim asked this as well, right? You know, where are those acacia trees? Where are all the things that they're using in order to build Mishkan? So some of it, of course, comes from the spoils from Egypt, et cetera, et cetera. We won't answer the question fully now, but what we do know is that in Shirat Ha'azinu, in Devarim, Perek Lamed Bet, for those of you who can flip quickly, Pasuk Yud, when we have the description of God finding Am Yisrael in the desert, of God bringing Am Yisrael from the desert. Look at how the desert is described. Perek Lamed Bet Pasuk Yud in Sefer Devarim, Yimtsaehu be'eretz midbar. God finds them in the land of the desert. Uvtohu yilel yeshimon, right? You see, God is finding them in a place of chaos. And so B'Tzalel creates a Mishkan in a place of tohu, right? You hear what's going on here. There is some kind of imitatio Dei going on, imitating God. God creates the world out of chaos using his Ruach Elokim, using the spirit of creativity that equals wisdom and intelligence and creativity and initiative. And God appoints humans in the 6th paragraph of the construction of the Mikdash in order to have Ruach Elokim to create a structure out of tohu. Okay, now there is an allusion to this idea in Chazal, right? Again, you know, sometimes when we moderns come up with ideas, and you know, I feel free to call Martin Buber a modern, right? From that perspective, it's always interesting for me, and I always look back at the Midrash to see, you know, where does the Midrash allude to this idea? Not does the Midrash allude to idea, but where does the Midrash allude to the idea? Because we're not reinventing the wheel. Chazal read Tanakh with tremendous care and precision and sensitivity to literary allusions. And so if you look here at source number 2, at the Gemara in Brachot, look at what the Gemara in Brachot says. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, Yodea haya B'Tzalel, litzaref otiot, shenivrahu vahem shamayim va'aretz, right? B'Tzalel knew how to combine the letters that God used to create the world. That's how B'Tzalel created the Mishkan. And the proof that they bring is Ktiv Hacha. It says with regard to B'Tzalel, Vayimaleo Torah Elohim b'chokhmah uvitvuna uvedat, that he had these 3 different, God gives him these 3 different types of wisdom in order to be able to construct the Mishkan: chokhmah, tvuna, and dat. Uktiv Hatam, and in Mishlei Perek Gimel Pasuk Yutet, when God is described creating the world, look at how God is described. Hashem b'chokhmah yasad aretz, konen shamayim bitvuna, b'da'ato tehomot nivkal. So what are the 3 kinds of wisdom that God uses to construct the world? Chokhmah, tvuna, and dot. Those are the same three kinds of wisdom that God gives to B'Tzalel. So there certainly seems to be some kind of parallel that is being drawn here between B'Tzalel constructing the Mishkan, or in general, the command to construct the Mishkan, and God's creation of the world, right? There's an element of imitatio Dei, of imitating God that's going on here. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's a very nice point as well. I'll repeat the point for the benefit of those on Zoom, which is that B'Tzalel's very name also fits nicely into this schema, which is, he is in the shadow of God, right? He's sort of, creating a microcosm of that which God created, right? There's an element, by the way, of reciprocity here that I think has to be noted before we actually get to the point that I want to make, which is that, God contracts himself, right? There's a lot of Chassidut talks about this, right? Kabbalah, right? God contracts himself to allow the world to exist alongside him. How does finite exist alongside infinite, right? God engages in some kind of act of tzimtzum, and he tells the people, right? Pru or vu, mil'u et haaretz v'kivshuha, right? Fill the land and conquer it, okay? Now, Am Yisrael creates a space for God within our space. That's the Mishkan, right? And at the end of Sefer Shemot, when God rests on Mishkan, what does it say? Uchvod Hashem malei et hamishkan. Right? So God gives us a world limale, right? Mil'u et haaretz. And then we create some kind of space for God, limale, to fill it, right? So there is some kind of reciprocity that's going on here. It's imitatio Dei, but it's also imitating God for the purpose of showing mutuality and reciprocity in the relationship. Another point that I wanted to bring to your attention is that at the end of the story of the building of the Mishkan, which is the last chapter in Sefer Shemot, Shemot Perek Mem, we again have, if you look in Shemot Perek Mem, we again have 7 paragraphs. And these paragraphs are also clearly delineated, but not by their opening words, not by Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe lemor or Vayomer Hashem el Moshe lemor, but by their closing words, like in Bereshit Perek Aleph, right? How are the 6 paragraphs delineated in Bereshit Perek Aleph? Vayi erev, vayi voker, yom echad, vayi erev, vayi voker, yom sheni, right? That's how we complete each of the paragraphs. Well, here, beginning in Perek Mem, Pasuk Yud Zayin, for those people who have a Tanakh, you can see it pretty quickly here. We start in Pasuk Yud Zayin with Vayi b'chodesh harishon b'shana sheni be'echad lachodesh hukam hamishkan, right? So on the first day of the first month, it's the second year, but of course, second year to leaving Egypt, we had to first get to Har Sinai, right? And it was the beginning of time, right? We're opening the construction of the Mishkan with this sense that we are pressing reset on time, right? First day, first month, okay, second year, but that's, I think, a technicality, right? But first day, first month, and now look at the end of that paragraph, at the end of Pasuk Yud Tet, Kasher Tziva Hashem et Moshe. Look at the end of Pasuk Kaf Aleph, Kasher Tziva Hashem et Moshe. Look at the end of Pasuk Kaf Gimel, Kasher Tziva Hashem et Moshe. 7 times. 7 times. We have 7 paragraphs. Now, at the risk of being a little bit stretching the point a little too much, which I recognize that whenever you get into these kinds of topics, you run that risk. I think that there is a strong correlation between these paragraphs and the creation of the world story. It's not a perfect correlation, but it's a strong correlation, right? So that we have here in this first paragraph in Perek Mem, Psukim Yud Zayin through Yud Tet, we have the beginning of time, and we have the placing of the Masach, right? If you look in the Michseh, right? If you look in Pasuk Yud Tet, Vayifros et ha'ohel al Mishkan, we put those animal skins, we put the tent over the Mishkan, thereby dividing between light and day. Okay, it's not a perfect correlation, I'm admitting, okay? But we'll see, it's going to get a little stronger in my opinion. If you look at the second day, right? The second day we have here, Pasuk Kaf, we have the placing of the parochet. The parochet is an interesting kli, right? Or it's not exactly a kli, of course. What is the purpose of the parochet? The parochet is that curtain. What is the purpose of the curtain? Yeah, it separates. Look back in Shmot Perek Kaf Vav. Turn for a second to Shmot Perek Kaf Vav. You're absolutely right. It has one goal and one goal only, and that is to separate. Look in Perek Kaf Vav, Pasuk Lamed Gimel. Okay, I'm in Shmot chapter 26, verse 33. V'natata et haparochet tachat hakirasim v'heveta shama mibeit laparochet et aron ha'edut. First you put the parochet, then you are meant to bring in the aron into the Kodesh Kodashim. It divides between the Holy of Holies and the holy space. Look at the next word, v'hivdila parochet lachem ben hakodesh and kodesh kodashim. It divides. That word v'hivdila, when was the last place it appeared? In Bereshit Perek Aleph. In Bereshit Perek Aleph. It hasn't appeared since then. Okay, that's a word that is a Bereshit Perek Aleph word. We divide between the waters and the dry land. We divide between the light and the darkness, right? The division here in the Mishkan, it's a continuation of the divisions of Bereshit Perek Aleph. Paragraph 3, back to Shmot Perek Mem, right? Paragraph 3 tells us about the Shulchan with the Lechem, right? That corresponds to day 3, which is the day of growing vegetation, right? Here we have the table with what we call the shoe bread, right? The bread that is made from the vegetation. Paragraph 4 here, look in Pasuk Kaf Daled, Vayasem et ha-menorah, the Ohel Moed, that of course corresponds to day 4, right? The sun, the moon, the stars. Day 5, right? So day 5 is the fish and the birds. It's interesting. I'm going to talk about it in a few minutes as well. It always bothered me. It still bothers me. It bothers me every single time I read Bereshit Perek Aleph, that day 5 is the creation of the fish and the birds, but that the animals are created with us on day 6. Right? Does that bother you? It really should. It really bothers Chazal. It really bothers me. Now, I have some good explanations for it from Chazal, from the Midrashim, which I think are wonderful and satisfying, but they're apparently not satisfying enough because it still bothers me. The difference, at least from, for the moment, I'm just going to say is fish and birds, it's the vertical relationship, right? It's what's above and what's below. Animals and humans, we share horizontal space, right? We're sharing the same resources, okay? We're created on day 6, and God tells us at the end of that creation, I've given all the same food and all the same living space to both of you, right? Battle it out, basically, right? You're eating the same things, you're sharing the same space. Fish and birds don't share the same space as us, right? We're not living in the water, we're not living in the sky. Day 5 is the Mizbach HaKtorah, right? It's that smoke that's drawing our attention upward, right? Day 6 is the Mizbach HaOlah, right? Or paragraph 6, I should say, is the Mizbach HaOlah, which is where humans bring animal sacrifices. So, there's a lot to be said for this correlation. Again, as I said, it's not a perfect correlation. If it was a perfect correlation, we would have all seen it, right, before. But is there some kind of hint that's going on here that the Mikdash is some kind, or the Mishkan is some kind of recreation of the world, structurally, linguistically? I think yes, right? I think yes, and I think Chazal were also aware of this, and certainly Buber spends a bit of time discussing it. There's other linguistic correlations that I think are what we call the Makah B'Patesh, right? The final hammer blow that really, I think, gives a certain sense that this is very deliberate. Look at this paragraph that I brought for you at the bottom of page 1, at the end of creation, and these are, of course, very, very, very familiar stories, right? Or familiar psukim, because we say them in Kiddush, right? Vayechulu hashamayim v'haaretz v'chol tzva'am, vayechal Elohim bayom hashvi'i melachto asher asa vayechulu vayechal, right? That means God completed, right? There's a sense of completion here. Well, look at the psukim that on the right side, I probably should have switched it English, Hebrew, but on the right side, which describe the completion of the Mishkan, but Techel kol avodat Mishkan ohel moed, right? You see where I am? That was Lamed Tet, Lamed Bet. If you look at the very, very end, it's almost the end of Sefer Shemot in Parak Mem, Pasuk Lamed Gimel. Look at those words that I bolded there. Vayichal Moshe et Hamilacha. Vayichal Elokim b'yom hashvi'i milachto. Right? Moshe finishes the milacha, and Elokim finished milachto. Right? I mean, these are things I think that are really very compelling. There are certain words like the word me'orot, right? God made the me'orot on the fourth day. Hame'or hagadol limemshelet hayom, hame'or hakatan limemshelet halayla, right? The great me'or, the great light. That word only appears in two contexts. It only appears in the Mishkan and in the story of creation, right? So, there's a whole array of linguistic and structural evidence that suggests that the construction of the Mishkan is being built on God's creation of the world. I'll just draw your attention to this last piece at the very bottom of page 1, which is what God does after he creates the world. At the very end of the creation of the world, is it a school there? Yeah. Okay. At the very end of the creation of the world, God blesses and sanctifies the world, or blesses and sanctifies the seventh day, right? The world ends, or creation of the world ends with blessing and sanctification. Creation or construction of the Mishkan ends the very same way. Vayivarech otam Moshe. Moshe blesses at the end of the construction of the world, v'kidashta oto, and he sanctifies the Mishkan. Right. So there's really, I think, a lot of pieces here that fit together. But perhaps the most compelling point, or the most compelling point that Chazal are aware of this idea, is a basic halachic point that we all are so accustomed to. Sometimes the things we're most accustomed to, we put the least amount of thought into them, right? And that is, of course, that every week we commemorate Shabbat. Really, what are we commemorating Shabbat? We're commemorating the creation of the world. So what should we be resting from? We should be resting from those things which God did when he created the world. I don't know, bringing light, whether it's turning on light or lighting a fire, planting, right? Third day. I don't know how we create animals, breeding animals, whatever it is, right? Those kinds, we should be learning all of our Lamed Tet Milachot, right? 39 categories of forbidden acts to do on Shabbat. We should be learning them all from Bereshit Parak Aleph, but we're not. Right? Where do we learn them from? We learn them from the construction of the Mishkan, right? So if you look, for example, I brought it for you here in source number 3 at the Gemara in Shabbos on Daf Memtet Amud Bet. Haditnan Avot Malacha Arbaim Chaser Echad Keneged Mi. Where do we learn, corresponding to what do we learn these 39 categories of forbidden labor on Shabbat? Amar Rabbi Chanina Bar Chama Keneged Avodot Hamishkan. And then the Gemara goes into detail, right? We learned the 39 categories of forbidden labor from people building the Mishkan. But that's the way we commemorate God creating the world, right? So it's really kind of a complex interweaving of these two events, which suggests, I think, very strongly that Chazal are well aware of this parallel, which I've been trying to draw here. So, what do these parallels mean, right? What are we meant to learn from the fact that the Torah seems to be suggesting that the construction of the Mishkan is modeled on God's creation of the world? So I think, we talked a little bit before about reciprocity, which I think is, one important point. God does for us by creating the world. We have a responsibility to do for God, to create a space for God, which I think is certainly part of it. But, I would say first and foremost, the goal of this is to teach us that we are meant to be creators. Right, that we are meant to be creators, which I think is not necessarily, to us, it doesn't sound like a big chiddush, right? But I think that this is the basic source for this idea. The first point that this parallel makes, I think, is a truly remarkable point, that in order for us to realize our Tselem Elokim, our spark of God, we have to be godlike in this very aspect, in creating, in coming to a world, and it's a chaotic world, right? And trying to make more order in that world. That's what gives human beings dignity, right? That's what gives human beings their godlike greatness, right? And of course, we're going to say in a moment, it's also what sets aside human beings from animals, right? Which we'll talk about in a moment. But the idea, of course, is that as human beings try to become worthy of the gifts that God gave us, and the fact that God created us with a Tselem Elohim, we have to be creators. We have to make order from chaos. This purifies us. It teaches us our purpose in the world, our purpose for creation, and perhaps most significant of all, it sets us apart from animals. Okay, now this point I think is not a small point at all. I think that it plugs into one of the very basic experiences in the Mikdash or in the Mishkan. But I'll start simply by saying, before I get there, before I talk about the difference between humans and animals, I want to say one more thing about defeating chaos, which is that, of course, Rav Soloveitchik talks about this a lot. Every step that humanity makes towards, greater mastery over the earth, greater ability to defeat the forces of chaos, whether it's finding a vaccine for a virus, or it's something in nanotechnology or computing, or getting human beings to Mars, or utilizing the Earth's resources in order to feed everybody well, right? I mean, it's not much more than 100 years ago that people were regularly dying out from famine because our agricultural abilities were not up to par, right? And so each of these discoveries and each of these advances in technology is another step towards realizing our godlike creativity, which realizes our human dignity. There are dangers in it, of course, which we'll talk about in a moment, right? But this is part of the goal of saying to B'Tzalel, Ben Uri, Ben Hur, L'Matei Yehuda, take your Ruach Elokim and run with it. Construct a world. Go out and defeat chaos, even though you're in the midbar. Figure out a way to create a world which is more orderly. And we learn that from the construction of the Mishkan. It's perhaps the most basic thing that we learn. Now, in terms of how it sets us apart from animals, again, as I said, this happens to be a topic that I think about a lot. It's I think you can hear it's a bit of a pet peeve of mine, right? So this idea that I would, if I were writing it, I know nobody asked me, but if I were writing it, I would put the creation of the animals in day 5. And it bothers me so much that human beings are created on the same day as the animal kingdom, the giraffes and the worms and the cockroaches and the ants and the lizards. And, that it really bothers me, because I would like to think that those animals have more in common with the fish and the birds than they have with us. Right now, everyone will know when you look at day 6, which creates the animals and the humans, that the day 6 strives to distinguish between the animals and the humans, right? There are 2 vayomers. There are 2 separate creations, but it still happens on the same day. And it's, I think, one of the great messages of Bereshit Perek Aleph, and you see it really all over the Midrash, that human beings are basically positioned between being animals and being godlike, right? This is, I think, one of the great Pico del Mirandela, what was his name? I'm talking about Giovanni Pico del Mirandela, one of the great humanist thinkers. Nobody knows what I'm talking about? Okay, it doesn't matter. He writes in his essay, he writes about this, right? This idea, this is the beginning of humanism, of, the Renaissance, where he basically says, this is the choice of humans, right? We can plug into our animal-likeness, and we are very like animals, right? Physically, we're very like animals. We are born and we die. We need to eat, we need to sleep, we are fertile in the same way. I mean, these are things that are really insulting in a certain way. We go to the bathroom in the same way, right? I mean, ad kidei kach, you were saying that you're from Cape Town, right? So in Cape Town, I remember that was where they first transplanted a baboon heart into a person. Was it a baboon or a pig? It was a baboon, right? Yeah, okay, so there you go, right? I mean, again, that's remarkable, but it's a little insulting, you know? I mean, you know, we are physically very like animals, but something sets us apart. We have Tselem Elohim. We stand upright and we have the ability to strive upward, right? We have the ability to be godlike. And that, I think, ultimately is part of what the Mishkan is teaching us. Think about it. Think about everything we do in the Mishkan, starting with gathering materials together, building them into a structure, right? Making clothing for the Kohanim, building vessels to cook in, cooking and processing food, right? And then what do? What's the main event in the Mishkan? We sacrifice animals, right? The Ramban says we're basically sacrificing the animal-like part of ourselves, right? Because that's the part of ourselves that sins, that rejects God, right? The part of the idea of the Mishkan is to correct or not to correct, to direct us to how to make sure that day 6 doesn't draw us down, right? Because we are animal-like and there is an animal-like side of us. And part of, I think, the goal of being conscious Ovdei Hashem, right? Conscious people who serve God is about creating a life where we are recognizing that our physicality is inferior to our spirituality. And that's what constructing the Mishkan ultimately is about. There's so many wonderful midrashim. I'll just mention one midrash that comes to mind, which I didn't bring through on the source sheet. There are really so many of them where they talk about this question because it's really a disturbing question. And they say, well, you know, here's the way that we can measure a worthy human life, right? Im zachita or zachit, right? If you live a worthy life, you will be told, you know, you were created before the Malachei Hasharei. You were created before the angels. In lo zachita, but if you don't live a worthy life, if you live a life in which you are subject to your physical drive, to your animal-like side of your nature, you will be told, you know, the worm was created before you were created, right? So that's the midrash, and that's I think it's a fantastic midrash. You stand between the world of Malachei Hasharei and the world of the angels and the world of the worms, right? And you get to decide what kind of life you live. And so part of this idea of constructing the Mishkan is finding within ourselves our godlike side, our creative side, our conscious attempt to separate ourselves from the animal kingdom. Okay, you know, again, while recognizing that is certainly a danger. When you look at the way in which we commemorate Shabbat, right? Look in source number 4. You know, imitation of God creating the world is not just about constructing. I kind of alluded to this before when I said, you know, the world of constructing, it's about defeating chaos, it's about pressing forward, advancing in technology, creating a better world, a more dignified world. But there are dangers to that as well, right? We could become demonic in our sense of our own human resources, our own human success. I use the word demonic in the Rav Soloveitchik way, right? Like arrogant, right? To an extreme where we edge out God, right? So, you know, the story in Shemot where we commemorate Shabbat, this is not a story, this is the 10 Commandments, right, that I brought for you here. It's built as a chiastic structure, A, B, C, B, A, right? You're familiar with this concentric or chiastic structure? Look at how we say it. These are, again, are very familiar words. Zachor et Yom HaShabbat l'kadisho, sheishet yamim tavod, v'asita kol melachtecha, v'yom hashvi Shabbat Hashem Elokecha, lo ta'aseh kol melachata v'nechavitecha v'tcha ואמתך ובהמתך וגרך שבשעריך כי ששת ימים עשה השם את השמיים ואת הארץ את הים ואת כל אשר בא מהלך ביום השביעי על כן בירך השם את יום השבת ויקדשהו. Look at what happens here, right? B and B is what we've been talking about until now, right? God created the world, therefore you be a creator. God created the world in 6 days. 6 days you should create, but we miss some really critical elements here. We miss the fact that at the center here is rest. Right? What do we learn from God constructing the world? What do we learn about us being creators? We learn that not only do you create, you also have to take a pause from creation. Right? I mean, it's actually, I think, even more wonderful than that, because when we have in Shmot, Perek Lamed Aleph, we talk about that paragraph 7 of the construction of the Mishkan. So when we have here, you have to keep Shabbos. One of the words that is common between constructing the Mishkan and constructing the world, I didn't mention it because it seems so obvious as to not even be particularly compelling, is the word aseh, right? The word aseh appears 7 times in the Bereshit story, in the 6 days of creation part of the Bereshit story, another 3 times in Shabbat, making it a key word there. It appears more than 100 times in the construction of the Mishkan. It's a very critical word. But here's the interesting thing. The interesting thing is that in Perek Lamed Aleph, in Shmot, chapter 31, verse 16, right? Pasuk Tet Zayin, we're told, and again, a familiar pasuk, Vishameru v'nei Yisrael et HaShabbat, la'asot et HaShabbat. Do you ever notice that word? You should keep Shabbat, should observe it, to do Shabbat. You create Shabbat. The lack of creation is a creation, right? That's what's going on here, right? We're not just resting. We're not just stopping from labor. We're creating rest, right? There's a constructive element that's going on here, and it is indicated by the use of the word la'asot et HaShabbat. You create Shabbat. The Midrash that I brought for you in source number 5 asks, formulates the question interestingly, Uman yivra bo la'achar sheshabat? What did he create after he rested? Sha'anan, v'nacha, shalva, v'hashket. Right? God created tranquility. He created peacefulness. He created the ability to have an inner world. Right? This is what ultimately is going to save us from becoming arrogant in our creativeness. It's also going to enable us to find meaning in our creativeness, in our construction, right? Work only can be meaningful when it's accompanied by rest, by a cessation of work, a conscious acknowledgement that work is not the ultimate goal, right? It's creating something for a higher purpose, like serving God, right? Like serving the community, right? So these are things that we can only really acknowledge when we stop, when we create a space for an inner world. But the other point that I wanted to make, and I think that this is a critical point, is that if you look in source number 4, if you look at the chiastic structure, we saw that B and B says, well, God creates, so you create. We talked about that a lot. We also saw that C, the center, is rest. But look at what encompasses this chiastic structure. Look at what envelops it. It's Kedusha. Ultimately, the goal of creation, which we learn from God, is that we take something which is material, which is physical, and we infuse it with the spiritual, or we make room for the spiritual, right? The idea is that our creation is surrounded by Kedusha, and ultimately, God, of course, creates a physical world, right? God creates a physical world, and at the conclusion of his creation of a physical world, the Kadeshoto, he infuses it with spirituality. That is, once again, it's a model for how to create. That's what I'm saying about the Mishkan, right? We are told, construct the Mishkan like God constructed the world, like God created the world. And that teaches you to be creators, and it teaches you to rest from your creation, and it teaches you to infuse creation with Kedusha. And this, I think, is really is one of the critical ideas, I think, throughout the Tanakh, right? Is that God teaches us that we make space for spirituality in 3 different realms: in the temporal realm, in time, in the spatial realm, in space, right? It's Kedushat Hazman, Kedushat Hamakom, and what's the third one? In humans, right? Kedushat Ha'adam. all three of these realms of Kedusha are learned from God. God is the first one to teach us that time can be infused with Kedusha. That's Shabbat. Every 7 days, Shabbat comes and it's Kadosh. But we're the ones who bring it into the Chagim, right? We're the ones who do Kiddush HaChodesh. We're the ones who determine which day will be infused with Kedusha each month, right? And God teaches us that the spatial realm can be filled with Kedusha. Where's the first place that Kedusha appears with respect to space? Before that, because we construct the Kodesh Kodeshim, and Moshe is Mikadesh that place. There's a place before, yeah, good. It was before, it was at the Sneh, which is Har Sinai, right? When Moshe is standing at the Sneh, and God says to him, Shal na'alecha me'al raglecha ki hamakom asher אתה עומד עליו admat kodesh, right? So God teaches us that a place can be kadosh. Where's the first place that we have Kedushat ha'adam? Kedusha of humans. Anybody know? Well, the first place where we have Kedusha of humans is when God says, right after Yetziat Mitzrayim, Kadesh li kol b'chor. Every eldest son it should be consecrated to me. And then before Har Sinai, Moshe tells the people that we have to prepare ourselves for Har Sinai by consecrating ourselves, right? So these three areas, it starts with God. I think we have to see them as an opportunity, because God gives us the gift of these spaces in which we can encounter spirituality. And in a way, what I'd like to say is, Ze kol haTorah kula zilug bar, right? This so much of Tanakh is built around this idea. Certainly, these three realms of Kedusha are what we encounter in the Mishkan. It, of course, is Kedushat HaMakom. It's a place which certain days of the year are days that you can encounter God and Kedusha, much more intensively. And it's all about Kedushat HaAdam also, right? The Kohanim can go to this place, the Kohen Gadol can go to that place, regular Israel can go to this place, the non-Jew can come to this place, right? But it's this sense of how one finds Kedusha in all three of these realms. I'll just throw out a couple other examples. How about Shemitah? Right, that's a beloved one, or certainly I don't know if it's beloved on everybody, but it certainly is a relevant one, right? I happen to be very moved by the experience of Shemitah. All of us here probably didn't grow up with it, right? And so the opportunity to experience Shemitah, I think, is something which is truly a wonderful privilege. What is Shemitah? It's Kedushat HaMakom, right? It's born in the spatial Kedusha. It's about Kedushat Hazman, right? It appears every 7 years, and it's about Kedushat Ha'adam, right? Think of, releasing people from the monetary debts, but perhaps more importantly, what happens on Yovel. I'm from Philadelphia. Ukratem dror b'chol haaretz. Right? You got the reference, right? Proclaim liberty unto the land. The Liberty Bell. No, you been there? Okay. Right. So that's it. That's Kedushat Ha'adam. So much of Tanakh is built around these three areas of Kedusha, and it's partially what we learn when we construct the Mishkan. We learn when we construct the Mishkan that we're not just meant to be creators, we're also meant to rest, and then we're meant to work on infusing our creation with Kedusha, whatever that means. And that, of course, is also designed to ensure that all of this great creativity does not become, what was the word I used before? Demonic, right? Arrogant, that it doesn't distance us from God, but that it ultimately becomes part of our service of God. Okay, I have a couple more minutes. I want to talk about the other question, right? We talked about Bereshit, Perek Aleph, and what we can learn from that parak for understanding the Mishkan, but all we really talked about so far was construction of the Mishkan. But I think that the more important question, also in terms of creation of the world, is not just what we learned from creation of the world, but what God intended by creating the world. Don't worry, I'm not going to answer that question in 5 minutes, right? That's one of the big questions, right? One of the big theological, philosophical questions. To what end does God create the world? Perhaps we can understand a little bit better when we look at this correlation between the creation of the world and the creation of the Mishkan. But I'll start by saying that, everybody asks the question about the relationship between Bereshit Perek Aleph and Bereshit Perek Bet, right? It's almost a tiresome question, right? Because, you have these two creation stories of the world. What is the relationship between them? So I'm just going to throw it out there that if Bereshit Perek Aleph is the creation, Bereshit Perek Tet is about implementing the purpose of creation. That's one way to read it. It's not the only way to read it, but it certainly is one way to read it, right? What does God do once he has created the world? He cordons off a space in that world. That's Gan Eden, and he places Adam in it. And that space is one that is designed to facilitate contact between humans and God, a place to facilitate a relationship, right? God places Adam into this place that has the Eitz HaChaim, that forbids the Eitz HaDat Tov Hara. Don't worry, I'm not going to get into that in the next 3 minutes, but certainly a place where God is accessible. Kol Hashem mitalech bagan leruach hayom, right? The voice of God is walking around this garden. God gives positive commandments and negative commandments in the garden, right? Mikol eitz hagan achol tochel ume'etz hadat tov hara lo tochal mimenu kibiyot achalcha mimenu mot tamut, right? You can eat from this, you should eat from this, you cannot eat from this. And of course, human beings are given a task, a purpose, or Adam is given a purpose in this garden where God's proximity is so palpably felt. And what is that purpose? Le'ovda u'leshomra. Now, at first glance, it seems that what is he supposed to do? He's supposed to work the garden, right? Agriculturally, right? He's an agrarian, he's a farmer, and he's supposed to cultivate it to garden, I don't know, build fences and, make sure that everything is growing properly. Many of the Mefarshim don't like this answer. Ramban doesn't like the answer. Various Mefarshim don't like the answer for several reasons. One is, as the Ramban says, and as the Midrash here says in source number 3, which I won't read for you inside for lack of time, but the Midrash says, why do you need Adam to cultivate the garden? The garden is fully grown, right? We already have called Eitz Nechmad L'Mar'eh, V'Tov L'Ma'achal. We have all these fine trees. We have lots of fruits on the trees, and there are rivers running through the garden that easily irrigate the garden. What is Adam doing, right? There's another problem, and it's actually a grammatical problem, which is that both the word le'ovda, to work her, l'shomra, they both end with a hey that has a dagesh in it, which suggests that Adam is working and serving something feminine. Garden is not feminine. Well, it is once in Shir, but it's mostly not feminine. That's what some of the Midrashim answer. But therefore, many of the Midrashim say, what does it mean, le'ovda u'leshomra? So some of the Midrashim say it means he's learning Torah, right? It means he was keeping Shabbat. It means he was bringing korbanot, right? These are some of the Midrashim I brought for you here in source 6 and source 7, right? You can look at that on your own. But what I think is really interesting is that le'ovda l'shomra, those two words appear juxtaposed many, many, many times when we talk about working in the Mishkan. La'avod et avodat ohel moed lishmor et mishmeret hamishkan, right? These words are words of service to God. I'll just conclude by saying Gan Eden represents an ideal place, an ideal setting for serving God, right? That's pretty much, I think, the simplest way in my mind to understand Aleph and Bet. In Perek Aleph, God creates a world. In Perek Bet, he gives human beings the tools, the setting, and the message of what is most important for them to do in the world. I'm not saying that Adam was not a farmer. I think he was, or I think he was supposed to be. But for a moment, I'm turning my attention to how the Midrash understands. By the way, I think farming, I think that's meant to cultivate our relationship with God, our skills in having a good relationship with God. But I won't get into that right now. I'll say something else, which is that, after Adam is banished from the garden, one of the really strange things in the story of the Torah, is that nobody tries to get back to the garden. Do you ever notice that, right? Avram never says, he's pretty bold when he speaks to God. He never says, bring me back to that great garden, right? And Yitzchak doesn't say, Yaakov doesn't say, David doesn't say, Shlomo doesn't say, nobody says it. Nobody says, bring me back to the Garden of Eden. Well, if it represents an ideal, why not? I think the answer is because Eretz Yisrael becomes the replacement for the Garden of Eden. It's Gan Eden 2.0, right? And within that context, we're told that Eretz Yisrael is a place, Vayikra Perek Kavav, that God says, V'hithalachti b'tochachem. I will walk amongst you. Rashi says there, like in Gan Eden, Kol Hashem mithalech b'gam. It's a place where God is quite accessible. And within that context, the place that is most Gan Eden-like is the Mikdash, is the Beit HaMikdash, right? By the way, Kruvim only appear in Gan Eden or outside Gan Eden, trying to prevent our entry, right? And in the Beit HaMikdash, welcoming us in, right? The Kruvim represent our connection to God when we come to the Mishkan, right? The Kruvim are not only in the Kodesh Kodeshim, they're woven throughout the warp and the woof of the Mishkan. They're woven into the fabrics. They're engraved onto the walls. They're everywhere, right? And so these Kruvim represent for us, I think, also some kind of recreation of Gan Eden. The Mikdash is there not just to teach us how to construct and how to rest from construction and how to infuse our creativity with Kedusha, but the Mikdash is there to teach us how to live our lives in a purposeful way, in a way that fulfills the purpose for which we were created. Yeah, I'll say one last point with regard to Hanukkah, and then we'll conclude this shiur. And that is that, of course, the Mikdash, for this reason, it's a place of great opportunity, right? It's a place of great joy. I think also Eretz Yisrael, one of the things that I experience very strongly on a personal level on Hanukkah is the gift of sovereignty, right? I think about it a lot that, 100 years ago, right? It's not so much time, when people celebrated Hanukkah, it was a completely different experience to talk about the loss of Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel than it is today, when we are so privileged to have this experience of Gan Eden, of living in the place where God promises to rest his presence and gives us the opportunity to serve him in a different way. And yet, I would say at the same time, with great privilege comes great responsibility. And one of the things that we learn from the story of Gan Eden, of course, is that the gift of living in close proximity to God is a precarious gift, right? It's one that when the wrong Kohen Gadol comes in and introduces foreign implants into the Mikdash, it becomes a place which we are expelled from, right? Just as Adam was expelled from Gan Eden for violating his relationship with God, so Am Yisrael was expelled twice from the Mikdash, and the Mikdash was destroyed. And the Midrashim say the destruction of the Mikdash is parallel to Adam being kicked out of Gan Eden, right? The famous Midrash where God says to Adam, Ayeka, right? And the Midrash says, just like God said to Adam, Ayeka, later on he's going to say, Echa Yashva Vadad, right? It's a parallel. And so I think that the story of Hanukkah, for us, for me, for us here today, it's both, it reminds us of our great joy, but it also has a warning, right? It also reminds us that when we let our guard down and when we forget that the Mikdash and living in Israel is meant to be a purposeful existence, one that is infused with a conscious quest for living closely and purposefully in God's presence, that could be a rather precarious thing to do, to let our guard down. And so, I'll just maybe conclude with a bracha that we should be zocha to continued success here in Israel, to continued service of God, to living purposeful lives, to being a great creative society, but one that also knows how to take a step back, to rest, to make space for Kedusha, to make space for Avodat Hashem. That's what we're doing here in Matan, right? So Chanukah Sameach.
Very inspiring.